Connor Murray used to spend his time talking about the world of Bitcoin SV on his podcast Bitcoin and Beyond, and he's one of the most knowledgeable and thoughtful commentators on the scene. But now he's no longer just talking. He's jumping right in and becoming an entrepreneur himself to create true reviews, which he plans to develop into a kind of TripAdvisor powered by Bitcoin SV. It was described as one of the standout projects at the Bitcoin Association's pitch day at the CoinGeek conference in Seoul. It's always encouraging to hear about a podcast host getting a real job, so it was great to talk to Connor Murray.
You're listening to CoinGeek Conversations with Charles Miller.
So Connor, thank you very much for doing CoinGeek Conversations.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
Now, people who are interested in Bitcoin SV will probably know you from your podcast, Bitcoin and Beyond. But let's start by talking about your new venture, because you're not just commenting on the Bitcoin world, you're actually jumping into it as a business. So tell me about that.
Sure. We're working on a project called True Reviews, and it's basically an online review platform that solves what we believe is the incentive problem with traditional review sites. So for the most part, the stat is something like 97% of consumers actually rely on reviews to determine which businesses they'll patronize, but there's a distinct problem that only a third of us will actually make reviews that are unsolicited, right? So generally, the only incentive that I've come up with to make a review for myself is if I'm angry at a business and I want to spite them, and, right? So maybe I'll go in and make a negative online review. But there's very little incentive if you had a positive experience to say that.
But
right?
there are a lot of nice people out there who do leave positive reviews.
So, and that's actually where I came up with this concept. Is I was actually on vacation with my wife and her family, and my mother-in-law is a very valued TripAdvisor reviewer. She spends a lot of time making really amazing reviews, and our entire vacation was basically she had spent all this time on TripAdvisor looking up locations and things to do, and we had a fantastic trip. And so there's a lot of power in good reviews. But what it kind of came down to, we actually got dropped off one day, and one of the tour guides said, please go on TripAdvisor and review me, because if you don't review me, I don't get business. And he was pretty much saying his entire livelihood was tied to whether or not people would, out of their own goodwill, go and write a quality review, right? So my mother-in-law is a great person, so she spends the time and writes the review. But for a lot of people, there's no incentive. So if you're not going to get anything back for it, there's a lot of time you have to take to do it. And really all TripAdvisor, as one example, gives you is like a reputation score, right? So they just give you some fake TripAdvisor points. And so it seemed obvious, if you're in Bitcoin, you start thinking of all these problems you can solve. And the first obvious problem is they're spending time on this, you should get paid for it, right? And even from a high level, imagine if you could just review a location. So you said, I went to Italy, for example, and I spent a week there, here's what I did. And if you just made an entire itinerary for someone, I mean, that's very valuable information, right? So in the same vein of, in Bitcoin, we talk about how do we tie value to data. That's just what we're hoping to do with reviews, and then also incentivize more of them in a few different ways.
But I mean, there's no problem with people like your mother-in-law being told, you're just going to keep doing this, but now you're going to get paid for it. But what about the other end of it, with the person who's going to have to pay for something that they would have had for free before?
Yeah, so we actually have a few different ways to tackle that. The very first is what we want to do. There's actually no easy way. So it's actually in the business's interest to incentivize their own patrons to review the platform, right?
That sounds a bit dodgy.
Well, so reviews are actually more powerful than advertising campaigns today.
Yeah.
And the way businesses get around that is now they just create a ton of fake reviews, for example. That's very common, right? And so what we're actually doing, which you can do this today with our platform, is businesses can actually issue tokenized assets on chain, which can be redeemed in exchange for a verified review. So what we're hoping to do is basically, we want to make reviews themselves more trustworthy. And the easiest way to do that would be to say, if let's say you came to my restaurant, for example, what we would do is actually, maybe on your receipt, we would issue a Bitcoin transaction that says this person was here on this day at this time. You could maybe add more data, like this is what they ordered, right? This was their server. And then when they actually went to make the review, we could tie it to that initial transaction. so we could verify the person was actually there. They're not some person just making things up. And then overall, well, okay, was it a quality review? If other people vote on it, then they'll get paid. Yeah. So hopefully the incentive is there.
I mean, that sounds good, but what about if I'm the person who is the customer who actually only just wants to make a bit of money, and I'll just say anything quickly, and if I'm going to get paid for it? I mean, in a way, you might say that the value of the current system is that people aren't getting paid, and so, in a way that could make them more trustworthy.
So there's an interesting concept there, right? So I guess we could separate it two different ways. Number one would be, well, how do you stop the problem of, if I'm going to get some kind of reward for just making a review, then, but you know what? Even someone just saying, I had a good experience, that itself is valuable, which people aren't incentivized to do that. Even just 5 words to say, I was here on this night and I had a great experience, right? Even just a thumbs up saying, I was here on this night, thumbs up. Even that alone is valuable to not just other users, not just the business, but it's valuable to other people as well, right? So people that want to understand, user data and how are people spending their time, all of that information is valuable. And so I guess the second part of your question was more so, I'm already doing this for free and therefore is it more trustworthy? Well, the reality of it is that things are not trustworthy at all on the internet. So in Amazon reviews, most of them are generated, they're fake. So if you don't have a cost associated with creating something, then you can essentially create, what we would call like a Sybil attack, right? You just create a ton of fake popular responses, and that has a twofold effect. Number one, you can make something look popular that isn't, which isn't trustworthy at all. And you can have the other effect of this thing, what happens a lot in America at least is a business will make national news, and then the next day, maybe they made national news for something very bad. The next day, a ton of people will go on their business page on Yelp and give 1-star reviews and just slander the business. And so then Yelp actually has to take it into their own hands and say, they'll actually lock down the page for reviewing, saying there's some extenuating circumstance that clearly these aren't real reviews. So what we would hope to do is, in the same way Bitcoin disincentivizes spam, by adding a cost there, the person that's going to troll the business has to think, am I willing to pay to troll the business? Yeah.
I mean, the businesses that are going to pay the reviewers, there's got to be a system that they are not only going to pay for positive reviews, obviously. They can't tell, they mustn't be allowed to tell what the review is going to be like, or...
Yes. So, and that's really what we want to do right now is, we're more focused on the verified reviews aspect. So Amazon has verified reviews because they control the system that says, we are backing that this person actually bought this product and we delivered the product to them. And so then they actually distinguish on their website, you have verified reviews and unverified reviews. So we're really more focused on the verified reviews aspect, which means that, again, what we have built right now is if I go into, and you can think of this either in physical retailers or even online distributors, when the product is sold, we have some API call that's made that actually issues a Bitcoin transaction, which means it's timestamped, and then we can add whatever metadata we want to it that has information about what was purchased.
Right.
How much data we add there's up to the business's discretion, our own discretion. And then when the user goes in and makes the review itself, we tie it to that same identity that was there at that restaurant or made that online purchase. Then when they make the review, we can say, this actually came from a real purchase. So basically a business would have to make their own fake sales at point of sale, and then go and make reviews.
So they'd have to subsidize people coming and having a meal.
Yes, exactly.
Which might be too expensive.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. So, I mean, how did you get into this? I mean, what you have your origin story in terms of your TripAdvisor experience with your mother-in-law, but were you having sort of talked about crypto on your podcast, were you looking for a way of getting your hands dirty and getting involved?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of, again, I think the problem that you hit in Bitcoin is that once you fully understand it, or you think you understand it, I don't think I fully understand it, you start looking at every single thing, that would be so much different if we added economic incentives to it, or microtransactions, or anything like that. So this definitely isn't the first project we've tried our hands at, but it was the first one that we realized well, we have the tools available to us to do this, and it's actually easy enough that it's a very clear problem that needs to be solved. So I guess the general answer to your question is we've tried a few different ideas before this, but this one, we finally feel like we have all the tools to accomplish everything we need.
And you're working with your brother, I believe.
I
is
am,
that right?
Yes.
And you're from Wisconsin. Is he with you in Wisconsin, or
he's in North Carolina, so
how far away is that?
Maybe 4-hour flight. So East
Coast,
I see, right. East Coast and in the middle of the country. So,
both sides of Europe or something.
Yes.
Right. But distance is not an object these days.
It's not. No, it's pretty nice. So, yeah.
And your background is in physics, right?
Yes.
Because you're obviously interested in the sort of economic aspects of Bitcoin, but also in the technology, right? I mean, do you see it as a particular problem that physics and economics are coming together is there a unique sort of contribution that Bitcoin is making to our economy because of the way that the sort of computer science and economics coming together in it?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting concept, right? I think what I always liked about physics was that it revealed the things that are just true around us, right? There's just something that you observe that's true all around us. And actually learning about Bitcoin is what made me even remotely interested in economics. I had no real interest in it before I learned about Bitcoin. And what I started to realize studying Bitcoin is that there are just these economic realities around us, and it seems like you're just making those same observations, but in a different way. You're making observations about how us as organisms interact with each other. I think as far as understanding goes, if you study Bitcoin, you actually then get a better grasp of economics than studying anything else. And I think that speaks to the true genius of what Craig created, really. And the reason why I actually even created a podcast was I had found myself on these online channels, and it was the first time I'd heard someone ever say something like, Bitcoin is an economic system. Stop worrying about the computer science. If you looked at Bitcoin for the past 7 years before that, it felt like this thing that if you didn't understand computer science or you didn't have some deep understanding of cryptography, then you weren't an expert. You had no saying on actually how it worked. And I found myself seeing this guy, CSW, writing all these crazy outlandish things about Bitcoin. And then I realized, wow, no one seems to even think about this or talk about it.
Because in order to design the software, you have to have a sort of theory about people's motivation and the way that they're going to be incentivized and stuff like that. Is that where it connects, do you think? Yeah,
and I mean, specifically when do you ever hear anyone talk about computer attacks in an economic sense? The first time I've ever heard that was Craig talking about it, and that's exactly what Bitcoin is. It's a system that disincentivizes attacking it through economic means, and that's really profound and something I'm actually surprised it took us so long to think about and understand as well. And I think Bitcoin is just inherent to the system, and that means that we can build incredibly complex systems that have a security rooted in economics that appears just generally truthful, I suppose. Yeah.
Obviously, Bitcoin SV has only been in existence for a year, really, and then before that, it came out of Bitcoin Cash, which came out of Bitcoin Core (BTC). How far back in that line did your interest begin?
So in 2013, I first read about Bitcoin, and I nudged my brother and I said, "Look at this thing. This is really interesting." But the more we researched it, and this was again 2013, we saw that there was a scaling debate happening. There was I loved Reddit at the time, and I would read Reddit, and I would see all these people saying, the block size needs to be increased. No, it's fine right now. And this was in 2013, and I remember thinking, okay, well, I will wait for the whole block size debate to settle out and to fizzle out.
Right.
Because it seemed obvious to me at the time. I just had read Satoshi's writings, and okay, well, we should scale the block size. So it seemed to me like something would be solved in about a year or so. And unfortunately, it wasn't. And so I kept kind of loosely following the space, I suppose, but I still was convinced that there would be a fork. And at the time, I was convinced there would be 2 Bitcoins. So I kept waiting for that, actually. And then it wasn't until 2015, 2016, I got interested in other cryptocurrencies because I didn't think Bitcoin would ever do that. And then it was basically in 2017, Craig gave a speech in Arnhem that I think is one of the most important speeches I've seen in Bitcoin's history. And I got really fascinated with him, and then Bitcoin Cash forked, and that's pretty much where I started trying to publicly express how I felt, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. You don't actually come from a computer science background at all.
No.
Or, in fact, economics or finance background.
No.
So, I mean, I must say, in your podcast, you appear to be a sort of an expert on both of those aspects. Is that something that you've really put some time into studying, or have you just sort of absorbed it along the way?
I suppose both. I wouldn't call myself an expert on any of those things, and I hope people would know that. But I think where I'm inspired, I guess, is there seems to be a lot of different areas that Bitcoin touches, and I definitely have this urge to be as much of a polymath as I could be.
But I mean, people's focus of interest has changed a lot during that time that you've been interested, because in the early days, I think I'm right in saying there was very little sort of discussion of building the kind of businesses that you're talking about today with your review site.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that really, if you'd come up with that then, people wouldn't have understood what you were talking about, presumably, would they? Because it was all just money and how much is it going to be worth and how are we going to spend it and that stuff.
Yeah, if I wasn't around then, but if you look at the old forum posts, there was a very brief stint where people were talking about attaching data to the transactions. And then that went away very quickly in about 2011, 2012. So it didn't last long, and it's interesting that, I don't know the reason why, but it does seem very interesting that it took us so long to start even realizing that there's a scripting language that allows you to do things other than payments. And I think generally, if you just study Bitcoin, you will learn about a whole range of topics that are so important to understanding our society, which is, maybe that's a very conceited thing, and I don't know if it's accurate, but it seems that way the more I study Bitcoin.
A year ago, I think, we weren't even talking about the central role of transactions as the sort of the future of Bitcoin. How convinced are you that we're going to stick with this focus and build on it as appears to be the case today, or is that just sort of this year's thing and next year there'll be some new idea that is going to be the way forward?
Well, I think, it's interesting because a year ago in November, I remember everyone was so shell-shocked from the hash war and all that kind of stuff. But it still seemed, I remember leaving London very optimistic because everyone that was there
at the CoinGeek conference in November in London,
yeah, they all had the same, it was like, let's just stop worrying about these computer science problems that are really meant to just drain your energy. They're meant to make you think you don't know about Bitcoin, and therefore you shouldn't be talking about it, and you shouldn't have an opinion about the direction that it goes. Let's stop changing Bitcoin, and let's all build any application you could possibly think of on top of it. And that's exactly what we've seen in the past year, is just people enabling all sorts of transaction types that we can't even imagine. And as there's even more tools being developed that allow you to create way more complex transactions that even we can think about. And so I think what's most likely is in a year from now, the types of transactions we're talking about are going to seem very simplistic. Just like right now, it seems like talking about data transactions seems very complex compared to regular payment transactions. I think it's just going to keep evolving, and use cases that we can't really think of right now will emerge. I hope so.
And hopefully, as far as the user is concerned, there'll be even less to worry about in the way of, long, Bitcoin addresses and wallets that have different ways of working, and all that will become sort of buried out of sight.
Exactly, and what we're hoping to do, and what I think everyone wants to do, is build an app. I don't want to build a Bitcoin app. I want to build an app that enables you to do something you couldn't do before without Bitcoin. And those are two unique things, right? Because I don't want to build something that just people interested in Bitcoin are using. We want to build something that just says, hey, as far as the end user knows, they're making money or they're receiving redeemable rewards to a business. And those are real tangible things that they don't have to care about Bitcoin about. They don't have to understand about Bitcoin. And I think that is coming. It just obviously takes some time to put together.
I mean, I think over the past few years, the media has been interested in writing about Bitcoin, and then there are sort of bodies like, consultants who like to talk about blockchain and stuff because it makes them look like they're on the cutting edge of something. And in a way that has been counterproductive, because as you say, really what would be great is here's a service or a product, and the footnote is, yes, it uses blockchain, rather than that being the headline, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we're moving in that direction, I think, don't you?
Yeah, and it seems like Bitcoin SV is the only one moving in that direction. It seems that this entire, again, and this is just one of those crazy, this is a fact and no one talks about it, blockchain was not invented with Bitcoin. Blockchain was something invented in, it was called a chain of digital signatures. It was written about in 1997. It just so happens that there's a book that Craig holds up that was written by a guy named Peter Wehner that talked about digital cash using a chain of digital signatures in 2003, right? So none of this is necessarily, that wasn't the innovation, and that's what this entire space seems to miss, that all because Bitcoin used the blockchain doesn't mean that was the innovation of Bitcoin. And so what I think we have now is a lot of people that are starting to grasp that, which means that you should be building applications that uses what makes Bitcoin unique, which is the economics and the ability to have payment transfers in ways we couldn't have before. So I think you're right. I think we will see very soon, what I hope is people are using applications and they have no idea that it's touching Bitcoin, but it provides them something new because it uses Bitcoin.
Right. Now, you've interviewed Craig Wright probably a few times, haven't you?
Yes.
What do you make of him? I mean, if for somebody who's sort of heard about him and maybe read a couple of things and they say to you, well, what's he like? What's your sort of standard answer?
My standard answer is that Craig Wright is someone that is he wants you to learn. And that's what I think is very misunderstood about him, is that he has this characterization of being brash. And I've never seen someone more willing to go out of their way to help you understand something. But he doesn't do it in a handheldy way. It's a very Socratic method, which is very frustrating sometimes, because he will say things that you don't think are relevant, or he'll ask you questions that you just don't even know what he's getting at.
So it's a dialogue.
Yeah, and there are times, even the times I've interviewed him, I've went back and re-looked at the conversation probably 4 or 5 times, and then I will maybe pick up something that he said that I didn't understand the first time.
Well, Steve Shadders, who at nChain, chief software engineer, I think he's called, or something, he says, Craig will start telling you something and you won't understand it. He says, I don't understand it for the first 12 months or 18 months, but gradually the light, dawns and I realize exactly what's going on and, how important it is.
He's someone that's extremely passionate about Bitcoin, and that's what excites. Every time I have a conversation with him and it starts talking about Bitcoin, he just will go on and on about it, and he wants you to understand where he's coming from. And I'm definitely appreciative that he even remotely takes the time, because he doesn't need to. And he gets a very bad rap from people who have never even tried to communicate with him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, CoinGeek presents itself with Craig Wright and Jimmy Wynn and Steve Shadders as the sort of like community leaders. How do you think we're going to get from the position where it's quite a small, tight-knit community with these people having a very sort of important leadership role, to what I imagine is their vision, which is a much wider community with less authority shared by such a small number of people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and Craig mentioned this, and it's probably the overarching principle of Bitcoin, is that he said specifically, if I don't have control, no one has control, right? And the whole point here is that we should be removing control from money itself. And so the more that someone has control to change the rules of Bitcoin, the less Bitcoiny it actually is. And it's funny you actually asked this question, because as I was sitting and watching Steve's presentation, it hit me with an analogy that having nChain at the helm, and CoinGeek too, because without Calvin even mining the chain,
Calvin Air.
yes, we wouldn't even be here. And so we have people that have defended Bitcoin to get to this far, but it seems to me like we've elected, what it feels like to be in Bitcoin SV is we have a president that is removing taxes, removing bad laws, and essentially allowing more freedom in the country that we live in, to the point where the president is making themselves irrelevant. And it's very exciting, because every single time I talk with Steve, or you watch a presentation that they're giving about their vision for Bitcoin, it is, we are removing our own importance, we are removing our power to restrict your ability to build on top of the blockchain. And so I think the way we get there is essentially we're almost there, where we are no longer going to be making consensus changes after February, or maybe one or two more after that. But once we take the power out of money, it means that it actually doesn't matter what nChain does, what CoinGeek does.
What do you mean, take the power out of money?
Yeah, so Frederick Hayek, he has this quote, and it's used by Bitcoiners of every chain, and they really love to repeat this quote, but they don't really think about it. I think he said specifically, "I don't think we will ever have a good money again until we take it out of the hands of government. That is, we don't do it violently, but we introduce it in a sly, roundabout way that they can't stop." And so everyone uses that quote to say, yeah, we have cryptocurrency now. We took it out of the hands of government. Look at what we've accomplished, right? But what we've actually done in cryptocurrency is we've taken the power out of the hands of government and handed it to centralized development groups, which in some ways is scarier, because they're not accountable to anybody. They all have this very weird political bent to them to just challenge as many authorities as possible. And if we take Bitcoin Cash as a very simple example, there is literally one person who says, I am Bitcoin Cash. I am deciding what Bitcoin Cash is. A lot of people are in denial about that. And that means that he has power over money. It means that if I were to put Bitcoin Cash under my mattress, as an analogy, I can't be guaranteed that he won't do something to debase it in the next 20 years, right? And so what I think we need to be, and what nChain is committed to do, what the entire point of Bitcoin was, is that there shouldn't be someone that has the ability to change the rules of the system. They shouldn't be allowed to debase your currency. And that means that I can put Bitcoin under my mattress, and in 10 years, there's not one central authority that can debase it.
Well, except that Craig is very clear that he is not wanting to take power away from government.
Yes.
I mean, he's a million miles from the whole sort of anarchy end of the crypto world, isn't he? So yeah, in that sense, Craig may be sort of arguably taking the power out of money, but he's not taking power away from the traditional political bodies of power. And so in a way, it's not anti-establishment in that sense, I guess.
Yeah, there's a big misunderstanding. Well, I think there's two things at the core of what you're talking about. Number one, governments do they derive a lot of power from the ability to mint currency and to debase the currency or to inflate, right? So in a way, Bitcoin does remove that, but Bitcoin also enables them to create their own tokenized currency on top of it, right?
Yes, which then would operate in pretty much the same sort of way, I guess.
Precisely.
They could print, or whatever the metaphor would be, more of it to to control their economy in the way that they would at the moment.
And what I think people don't understand is they want Bitcoin to be something that does skirt around existing law, right? And in his example, he always brings up his Liberty Reserve. Liberty Reserve was a perfect example of an e-currency that was distributed, decentralized, all this other stuff, but it was still vulnerable from someone just coming in and taking it. And so I think the whole point that I try to express is that all these political fights that people seem to want to use Bitcoin for, that's not Bitcoin's fight. Bitcoin's fight, to me, is we now have a stable money, and it means that you can use that however you'd like. It means that you can build on top of that however you'd like. We've already made a big victory by having Bitcoin exist, and it's out there, right? But people seem hell-bent on wanting to use Bitcoin and to go for another victory, which is essentially using it for their own political purposes, which I would be very wary of. I'm very wary of someone who wants to take something that is essentially my freedom and use it for their own motivation. And I think that's where, if I was someone that created Bitcoin, I would be very annoyed and very frustrated at how people are using it to accomplish other goals that maybe I didn't care about, right?
I mean, I think there is something about new technologies. If you look back on the internet and probably television and radio, maybe even electricity and stuff, at the time that their possibilities become obvious, many people will think of, a massive range of problems that can be solved using this, and probably with Bitcoin as well. People can project onto the future with the hope of Bitcoin the political future that they would like to see, and that perhaps tells us more about the person than the technology.
Absolutely, yeah. And at the heart of it, Bitcoin enables free trade, and free trade has done more to progress humanity, our existence on this planet, than anything else. And I think people need to stop worrying about political aspirations and look at what this thing can help us achieve. And it achieves something way greater than, in my opinion, political activism does. I think that free trade has always outpaced any sort of activist movement.
But by pinning it with free trade, you are sort of giving it a right-wing kind of flavour, whereas in all this sort of like talk of banking the unbanked and stuff, you might think it's a way of promoting equality, and people who don't have opportunities are going to get better opportunities, which is a more left-wing vision for the future.
Yeah, and especially in the United States, right-wing, left-wing are very different, I think, than everywhere else in the world. But at the heart of it, it seems to me that Bitcoin allows equality of opportunity, right? Which is much different than equality of outcome. And at its core, I don't know if equality of opportunity is a right or left idea. It seems to me like a very classical liberal idea, right?
Yes.
And what I find very interesting about Bitcoin is, if you want to build a business, no one can stop you. If you want to exchange it, no one can stop you, right? There's a lot of interest there, and I think even as myself, I've evolved maybe in my thinking of getting a greater appreciation of free trade capitalism, which maybe historically, especially in the United States, is a right-wing idea. But you come to learn those concepts are completely outside of politics. It's economic reality, essentially, that capitalism produces better outcomes. It produces more prosperity. And the problem that we have in the United States is that capitalism is intertwined with what we essentially call crony capitalism. Yes. And the best part about Bitcoin is that everyone is equal, as far as like Bitcoin is agnostic as to who you are, right? And to me, that's a quality of opportunity, which is a fantastic thing.
Right. Well, yeah, I guess maybe the good thing is that it doesn't quite fit either a left-wing or a right-wing vision. And when we recognize that, then we'll be looking at the reality of what we're talking about here, rather than trying to sort of project existing ideas onto it.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And I would be very wary of someone who wants to use Bitcoin to further some cause. That should cause anyone that holds Bitcoin concern, because it means you have to worry about what they're doing. And that seems to me antithetical to what Bitcoin is about.
Great. Well, Connor, thank you very much indeed for talking to me, and very good luck with your new business.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you want to tell us how we can see what you're doing? And
yeah, so we do have a website that you could go to right now, but you couldn't use. It's truereviews.io. We're actually we wanted to launch for this weekend, but we hit some Bitcoin errors that will probably be resolved in February. So I won't get too into the weeds on it, but basically we're trying to figure out whether we should redo our architecture. We're generating a lot of transactions, so we're hitting issues with how we generate them. But you can go to truereviews.io and be prompted to register for like $10,000 just to prevent people from seeing our website. So don't pay $10,000 to register for our website. It's just a way to prevent people from seeing it. So,
right, okay.
yeah.
Well, this will probably not be published for a few weeks, so things may have changed by the time people take a look.
Great. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you for having me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Connor Murray, and every success we hope with true reviews. Please do subscribe to CoinGeek Conversations if you're using the podcast version. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.